That if you take that opportunity to buy out your land and take responsibility for the asset, it's not about boosting egos, it's about serving the wider community and ensuring that you protect what you have taken responsibility for the rest of the community and for future generations. So I think that longer perspective, the multi-generational perspective is such a huge part of it, and a big part, I imagine, why a lot of people will come involved at a volunteer level on boards and things, is because everybody wants to make things better for those coming after them. Generally, don't they? We don't set out to make it worse.
Welcome to The Radical Land, a podcast series by the Stove Network in association with Community Land Scotland. In 2020, the Stove, along with Community Land Scotland, commissioned 4 artists to unearth the stories of radical land ownership in the country through a handful of residencies with community trusts from Edinburgh to the Hebrides. In this series, we will speak with some of the artists and community landowners involved in the project. Through a series of interviews and conversations, we explore the stories of community land ownership in Scotland and how this project unearthed new understandings of ownership, creativity and community in the process. Galson Estate is a community-owned estate of 56,000 acres of coast, agricultural land and moor in the northwest of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. The estate comprises 22 villages running from Upper Barvas to Port of Ness, with a population of nearly 2,000 people. The estate passed into community ownership on the 12th of January 2007 to be managed on their behalf by the Trust. We speak with artist in residence Virginia Hutchison, alongside Lisa McLean of Galson Estate and Fiona Rennie, a fellow artist who has supported Ginny throughout the commission, connecting her with local residents, as well as featuring in the artworks herself. On arrival, we travel to the Butt of Lewis, which, contrary to its name, is in fact on the northern tip of the island. We meet with Ginny, Lisa and Fiona by the cliff's edge. By them sits Ginny's artworks, a collection of 6 bronze objects cast into the shape and appearance of cut peat. On each, a QR code shines through the deep black grain of the cast peat. At the Butt stands a lighthouse, an impressive structure built in 1860, and as far as lighthouses go, it's one of the more confident ones, holding its own against the ferocious gales of the North Sea. We're taken up to the top by the caretaker Rory, which, as someone who struggles with heights at the best of times, was more than a little unnerving.
Is the Ardnamurchan one on Northern Lighthouse Board one as well?
Which one?
Is it Ardnamurchan cat?
Yeah, Ardnamurchan. I went up that one a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's all.
In spite of the vertigo, the view was impressive. It was a clear day, and the curve of the northernmost cliffs could be seen for miles, and the winding roads shone half silver in the sun. By them, the vast sea, a bluish grey that rippled to the horizon.
Fantastic. We were saying that when we got the boat over yesterday, it was really special. Like, you could just see.
We were relieved to be back on dry land, albeit a little dizzy. We sat by the cliff's edge, where Ginny introduced us to her sculptures that lay stacked like fallen dominoes by the lighthouse.
Parts of Galson. So, this is Galson. This is Bor.
When the artworks are scanned via QR code and mobile phone, an immersive soundscape brooding and full of texture plays. A conversation with a local person, a voice listing features of the island's landscape, a waterfall, a small pool, a precipice. All of this with an occasional staccato-like interjection of a lone Gaelic voice. Ginny speaks about the process of recording some of the interviews during the pandemic and the difficulties in doing so.
So this was an interview that we did. It's kind of interesting doing this during lockdown. It was obviously pretty tricky, but there was these little moments. It's a bit like, you know, when the weather breaks and the sun comes out, and had these wee moments of during lockdown last year where you could actually see people.
Yeah.
So it was kind of nice. We had 2 interviews with Agnes, one at the start and then one with Fiona as well. So these 2 chaps, I mean, I'll let you listen to them. They're really nice. She sort of goes into the bit of the history of why it came about up here. And then it sort of evolves into a sort of broader conversation about crofting and the history of crofting, and obviously because she's coming from that kind of background, the Community Land Scotland and setting up the trust from the start. Lockdown came again, then there was another break, and we got to hang out in a coffee shop. So Ballon Trushaw, so you're associated with Ballon Trushaw, which I thought was quite nice. So although these are loaded up with Fiona's archive, recent interviews, these are basically just blank now for...
So there's no sequence really. I mean, if you just stumbled upon number 3, it wouldn't matter.
I think that was the idea. I think I was trying to initially.
Yeah.
But then, you know, things just grow organically and you have to respond to it. Actually, I thought they'd be actually really nice as a collection.
Yeah.
You know, it would be nice just to kind of stumble across it and click it, listen to it and go for a walk. And it's having been sitting at a computer for months listening to them is so different when they're out here.
Yeah, I bet.
Completely different.
In what way, Julie? Just like, or do you feel like you understand it better when you're in the place?
Yeah, I think so.
I think there's something tangible about it as well, just being in the landscape that the people are talking about, and you're listening to the place names and seeing
the sounds of the earth.
There's like the sounds of the earth, but there's like place names, and then Ginny's also, we picked out words from Dad's book about describing what the landscape looks like. We had both, but I think you've just done the English on that, which is quite nice.
Yeah.
The Gaelic place names and the English description of what place means is like a lovely poetic description of place without it being
a translation
cliche or a translation. Yeah.
Because that's what we tried. That's what I was trying to do, and you were saying it doesn't work like that.
It won't work.
It won't work.
Trust me.
Can't do that.
I imagine that people also, you know, I think the other thing for me that would be different about listening to it here, especially as an outsider, a visitor, is that your journey to stumble across it is completely different from going into a more sterile box building space and then into a gallery space. You go in with a completely different set of expectations. You've already made a particular set of decisions. You know, different journey. So for me, there's something about this that you might. Different types of people might end up listening to it,
and you said yourself even yesterday, the ferry journey. It's not just transport here, is it? It's not like when you hop on the plane.
The story of how you got here affects how the experience that you have.
I mean, you talk about expectations, and I think that's really important as well, because I think as soon as you start talking about public art, people do get a wee bit tetchy. You know, there are expectations, but if there's something like this that is absolutely designed to change, so the content is designed to evolve and to change and to respond to what's happening in the community. Even the bronzes, I would quite like to make a wee contract for the bronzes that if they stop working, they get remelted into something else, so that you can keep up with people's expectations and not drown in
it just aligns really with what the trust is about. It's just like it's about sustainability and for generations, not just right now.
Beneath each interview inscribed in the soundscape, a deep drone hums along with the cadence of human voices. Jenny explains where these curious sounds come from.
But also, so each one of those has me and Fiona underneath it. And in another layer to that, there's a conversation that started having with another artist called Stevie Hurrell. I don't know if you've come across Stevie Hurrell. But he did a big project in Barra a couple of years back just about that. It was about the fishing villages and how Gaelic language was, how they were basically making decisions in central Scotland, central England and European Union about fishing rights between Barra and Ireland, and how it misrepresented their culture and the way that they should be fishing because they didn't understand Gaelic. So I started having a conversation with him about that.
It's amazing how it all links so politically as well, though, doesn't it?
Absolutely. But he then went on to create a project, create an algorithm that could take the sounds of tectonic shifts in the earth and speed it up so that it was audible to the human ear.
Oh wow!
It's amazing. So his installation, it was a tramway for a while in Glasgow. It's supposed to be listened to live. So it's supposed to be an immersive kind of live experience, but he lent me some of the recording tracks for these, which I think is really nice, because as soon as you bring them out here, you're getting that really nice bearing of like the movement of the earth, the Gaelic place names, and then these sort of field recordings on top of it. I mean, I kind of ruined it now just by explaining it, and I should have just like listened to it.
Each of us with headphones listened to the works. And pacing, we were absorbed and silent as the soundscape swelled and mixed with the noise of the wind and the sea. After which, we travelled to a nearby cafe to further discuss the project, the artworks, and the community within whose land it all happened.
It would be good to get a heads up on this question.
I asked Ginny, Fiona and Lisa whether or not the project had changed their perception or understanding of community ownership broadly. Fiona first responded.
I could probably start because I have quite instinct reactions to that. I think to me it's something that because I've been involved in my own project 5 years ago, it's something that has been ever constant in my practice, whether it's been on the peripheral or in my work with the trust. So it's not, the project hasn't really changed my understanding of it, but I think the perspective of working with Ginny, someone who's not been involved in it, has been really interesting, seeing through fresh eyes, like and explaining in different contexts the work that we do. That's been really refreshing in a nice way. So I don't think it's changed, to answer your question, my understanding of it or my relationship to it, but it's been lovely to experience it through another pair of eyes.
And Jenny, for you coming in from that slightly objective angle then, did you have much of an understanding of, or a notion of community ownership?
Of community ownership? No, not at all. Not at all. I think a lot of folk who are even vaguely interested in politics or Scottish politics had a cursory understanding of it. It suddenly got very quiet in here. No, I think what it made me realise is that I didn't really have much of an understanding of it, or I had a very basic understanding of what land reform was and what community ownership was. And really, I think it's a bit like you talk about embedded audio files. It's once you're embedded within a community and this information starts, it's not information that you can just press a button and download. You know, it had to be. It was a very slow process. I don't know how you could have done that maybe in a month, because it needed to talk to you and then sit with it and then get pointed in the direction of Agnes or Fiona, and then just trying to make sense of what it means to other people, because everybody's got a different understanding of it. Everybody's got a different understanding of the history, and everyone's got a different understanding of the present situation and what it's doing for people. And then of course there's like this dreaming, this sort of like future imagination of what it might do in the future, and that's just as important, I think, as the past and the present.
Very nicely for me, because I was actually, I was thinking, yes, it hasn't changed it for me, my view on what community ownership is, but I think it's like a different lens, without a doubt, a different lens. And I think community ownership is different to every person. I think it means different things to every individual person, and I guess that's a big part of the beauty of it, isn't it, that we've been able to use this way of capturing radical community ownership and what that looks like. And Ginny has interpreted that by speaking to different people and spending time with the community, and I guess I deal with the nuts and bolts, I guess, of community ownership. So for me, this has just been so lovely to have something so, I don't know, I guess I don't even know what word I would use for it, just something much deeper than looking at data or even looking at service requirements and things like that. I think it sort of gets to the heart of it much more quickly than I think we could do through another means.
Oh, fantastic. So with that in mind, the project itself is stories of radical land ownership. Now, Colin and Saskia, through their commission, have kind of explored and unpacked that notion of radical. Do you feel that Urus is an example of radical land ownership, or do you feel? Is it just what happens?
I think it is just what happens, but I think when you look at it from out with it, I think it is radical. I think it's very radical, and I think particularly what you were saying as well, Ginny, maybe you didn't have much of a knowledge of what community ownership was, because in Scotland I think we're hearing more about it. It's it's much more part of the agenda all the time now, whereas you speak to someone from elsewhere and it's almost so radical that people can't quite grasp what you're even talking about. So yeah, I think it is very radical, and I think what we do in the Ouris here in Galson is it's underpinned by projects that seek that sort of vision for the community, and we seek to be radical to achieve that. So yeah, I don't think we should lose that. That's important. Yeah, I think someone described it one time, and it might have been your dad, Fiona Frank, as like a sort of quiet revolution, and it is. So that makes it radical.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of the word radical. I think it's an interesting word. I didn't fully understand what stories of radical land ownership. What is radical land ownership? I think a lot of folk don't really understand what that word is doing to the other two words, land ownership. What is land ownership? Why is it radical? What makes this different to any other form of ownership? But that, I guess, is what this project is trying to do. It's actually taking something that we think we know about and actually holding it against all these other kind of understandings or beliefs about ownership and land ownership and community land ownership. It's community land ownership, and that's what makes it different.
Yeah, it's the kind of keywords there is of stories. So it's the lens by which you look into. So, it's the broader picture of it. We may seem radical and may seem kind of, but what actually touching base, it's a human connection to land. It's a human kind of community spirit. So that radical lens is sort of diluted because it's actually much more focused, and it's about what people do by their day to day. And you don't, stick on your jacket and go, this is my radical jacket and I'm going to do radical work today. It's your day to day, it's your work.
That's it. You tend to think of the word radical being something like sort of almost superhuman.
Yeah.
It's like activism. But you wouldn't consider yourself to be an activist, would you?
I think it goes back to what you were saying, Lisa. I think when you're involved in the everyday, and I think Lisa as well, to a certain extent, you've been involved in it so long, and I have in a different perspective. So both my parents were really involved in it from pre-buyout even, and my dad, my mum were helping out in land reform across Scotland before even that. So I've grown up, that's just the norm. So to think of it as being radical is hard, but then when you see it again through the perspective of somebody who's seeing it from out with, and you're having been away at uni and describing these projects to people who've got no involvement in it, they're like, wow, that's mental how much you're doing there, and wow, it's amazing that you're doing this, and I wish I lived on community-owned land. And I'm like, well, I guess in that context it is radical, because it's radically different to all these other places and what all those experiences are. So it's hard.
I think radical as well for me means it's sort of linked to opportunity, and that doesn't come with other types of ownership. I think it's much more. There are much more enablers in place within a community-owned estate than there might be otherwise within a different type of ownership.
And there's maybe more access to them. So because we're on the ground and where people are able to physically, well, not yet, but come into an office and speak to someone directly, that's radically different than an absentee landlord who's anonymous and you're not able to even name them, far less go in and talk to them about projects or development.
And to have a land ownership model that comes with a vision and values, that's probably quite radical as well for land ownership.
And I don't think even in our day-to-day, I don't think radical isn't any of our strategic plans. It's not in our history. It's not in, looking back to even pre-buyout, like back to you want to go as far back as the land raids. They weren't described as, they are described by others as being radical, but within the communities in which they happened, we didn't see that as being radical at the time. We just were.
Yeah. But I think it's important for us to not become insular, but it's also important for us to not get too hung up on the radical, and we still have a job to do day to day, and that's important. So I think we have to find that sort of steadiness that comes with day to day.
Is there a unique quality about, in your experience, across community land ownership projects? Is there a unique quality of the communities that go through this, that do this?
Yes, I think so. I don't think that there are characteristics or traits that we can say don't exist in other communities and other places either. But I think people in these communities have had to survive, and they've had to be creative in how they survive. So I think the opportunity to buy your land and look for ways to make that work from a socioeconomic perspective is not it's something they're able to do, because I think those leadership qualities exist in these places already. The cooperative movement is something that was very prevalent here. Social enterprise generally is prevalent. So I think those qualities and confidence exists already. But I think we talked about this earlier today. I think there's a humility that comes with a culture, certainly that I see in Lewis or in the Western Isles, that allows people to understand that if you take that opportunity to buy out your land and take responsibility for the asset, it's not about boosting egos, it's about serving the wider community and ensuring that you protect what you have taken responsibility for the rest of the community and for future generations. So I think that longer perspective, the multi-generational perspective, is such a huge part of it, and a big part, I imagine, why a lot of people will become involved at a volunteer level on boards and things, is because everybody wants to make things better for those coming after them. Generally, don't they? We don't set out to make it worse.
I think Gaelics get a big part to play in it as well. I think about Richards and Brechin. And I don't know if that is a Gaelic speaking part of the country. Not predominantly.
Not anymore.
So I know, from talking to you, you're saying, well, it's a community that has a long history of sort of political and cooperative activism or working. And I think a big part of that has stemmed from having quite a community that's centred on a language like Gaelic. So the whole landscape basically is every part of this landscape has a particular Gaelic place name associated with it. And these Gaelic place names are not necessarily descriptive, they're historic. They tell a cultural story, they tell a story of a person, they tell a story of how the land's been used, and sometimes there are words that actually aren't translatable. So to have a community that's based on an island that works and lives around this local knowledge is quite fragile, and as you say, it's not something that can be run, dictated or owned by someone that doesn't actually understand that language or understand that culture or the culture that's embedded in that language. And so I think there's always been a conflict between the landowners that don't come from here and the Gaelic communities that live here. And so I think that conflict and that fight and that resistance has always been there. Actually, when you see the Gaelic culture coming back into play a lot more now, that's quite exciting. And then you sort of see bigger movements like this, like all the land trusts that are actually starting to take ownership, is great. It's amazing.
Yes. Fiona, would you agree, as a Gaelic speaker?
Yes and no, but I think there's a Gaelic culture that's not necessarily only linked to people that speak Gaelic anymore. That sounds weird. Like you can appreciate it as a non-Gaelic speaker, that there's a certain way of life, there's a certain appreciation of place and community that's linked to Gaelic culture that's not insular to only Gaelic speakers. So I definitely think it's something special, but I don't think it's absolutely. And I think it's a historical thing. I don't think it's not their fault that we don't speak it as much, but there's been a massive resurgence in Gaelic speaking in the last 10 years even. Like the number of Gaelic schools in the mainland shows it, but it's a living language here as well as it's part of our heritage, so it's shaped us without even being aware that it's shaped us. Getting arty-farty again, but you get I don't know if I'm able to articulate it right.
I agree with that as well. I think it's become more complex over time because we now have a generation of people who don't speak Gaelic but are very passionate about the fact maybe that their children go through Gaelic medium, and I think that creates a new connection to Gaelic heritage and native Gaelic speakers, and I think we have to, as a community, we have to be mindful of how we ensure that things like the place names and the permanency, the historical things, people understand that it's their place in that new sort of arena for the language and the culture.
No, it's literally my next question was what was the role of, but I suppose I was thinking there in terms of the culture that's been talked about there as like that rooted culture, but then it's an adaptable culture and it's a welcoming culture, and it's an evolving one over time, and I think there's that thing, I guess, around Scottish culture, particularly with Gaelic and Hebridean kind of communities and the histories, is that, Bonnie Prince, then, shortbread, and, that kind of wider appropriateness, which might have been useful at a time, but it's sort of a bit of a tired rhetoric. And would you say then that the role of creativity is to keep asking those questions? And, Jenny, yourself not being from here necessarily, but coming in and learning, especially around community land ownership, do you feel like that creativity is contributing? Where is this going to go next? Is you going to want more creativity, more artists brought through? So these are
more conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, was that actually an actual question?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think what this project, we had a little experience of that because obviously we did work with Fiona 5 years ago on a project, but I think for us it's I think it has to become core of how we engage and how we document as well what we've been doing and just carry on with this. And I know even we've discussed today another project potentially, and just using a different type of art form for showcasing something else that we want to sort of commemorate and look at as well. So I think it just needs to become much more, I hate to use the word mainstream because I know it is, but I think it needs to be much more general practice of what we do as an organisation or as a sector, because I think because it's community land ownership is so complex and it is so meaningful and so different meanings to different people. I think you have to be able to tell the stories in different ways to different people.
I think that's where art comes in though, and we've talked about this before, Jenny. It's a different way of articulating and digesting all of this information that is quite complex and putting it in a way that evokes a reaction or a response that doesn't necessarily just tell you the words. It makes you think about it yourself. It makes you feel involved. You might want to elaborate on that. I know we've talked about it in great length and I won't go on too much, but I think art has a real opportunity of doing that in ways that a report could not ever do, and it'll reach different people and it'll engage with the right audiences because of that as well. So I think it's, I don't want to say plugging a gap, but it's reaching ways that we couldn't have reached before.
Yeah, it's. I think it's also doing something slightly undefinable as well. There's a word list to, particularly your piece on it expresses words and language and story, but there is very much a sort of ethereal otherness to it, and I think that does play homage to the place, to that culture, to that Hebridean kind of identity, but also draws in something new. And I think I think because of your perspective and your voice in the pieces as well, it gives that. And maybe, if somebody walking by wouldn't know that that's your voice, which would be interesting from that other objectivity. But you've got four. I realised there was four voices, I think, in there. There was yourself. There was the Gaelic as well. There was the community voice, the interview, and there was the land, literally talking through the back area there, and that was really quite interesting. And also there was another kind of added kind of world to that, whereas you're walking around in the land, you hear the sea, you hear the seagulls, you hear and it's a real sense of movement and time and the growing nature of this place, and particularly the displacing of voices and the staccato thing. There was a slightly kind of like unnerving quality to it, and it was interesting being on the edge of a precipice looking down. That you're being drawn in, but there's a danger, there's a real. Yes, I could go on about it.
Something about which made me think there when you were talking, and when you were saying about telling the stories, and when you were saying about this balance of the history and the culture not being a barrier. So thinking about new people coming in and new audiences. There's something about the medium of the work that you created, Ginny, specifically, that you can tell immediately it has a depth of has come from literally the Urus and the place and the research you've done. However, as a complete newbie and an outsider, I felt I had immediate permission to connect to it and to listen, because it had been brought into a different space that was entirely new. So therefore there was an equality from me coming in to you coming in who's lived here all your life, come back, So it's like we can come into a shared space.
I think that's right, and I think we have to help people understand their responsibility in coming to live somewhere like this or be in this place, because they have to know this is what matters to the people who live here. So don't come in and think you understand immediately. I think take time to understand this community and what's important, and then see how you can add value to it.
I think that's kind of what I was thinking when we were putting that together. Like you were saying, I think it was important that there's enough room in those conversations and the beats that you can place yourself. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a continuous 3-hour interview of us in the cafe, that there had to be enough room for you to feel that you're part of that conversation. There was also a bit just at the end of it when we were talking to Agnes, and she directs me by name. And I decided to leave that in because I kind of thought it was important as well that I wasn't just a voyeur in this. Yeah. That everybody's got a responsibility. Everyone's an active participant.
Yeah. Well, you're creating history every day, and I think that's what it. Like you say, you don't go out and think, "Oh, it's radical ownership today," but there is every so often you see those little milestones in the journey that you think that was history, and I feel that because I remember clearly, with the estate business going through. You see letters from the old factor, and you see that and you think that's what you're doing, that's what we're doing today, and someone else will look at these things in the future, and it sort of reminds you that hey, you're a little part of it, but it's all critical at the time.
But to go back even further, I think to bring back something you said about the place names, that's a small way of that involvement as well, because it's easy enough to come in and that looks like the Bay of Seals, for example. It's a place that's nearby. Someone's just read the English translation on the map and gone, oh, Bay of Seals, oh, there must be seals there. But actually it's Knochamook, which is the hillock of the pig, but their pigs they're talking about are the sea pigs, the whales. So actually it's the Bay of the Whales, which is a completely different context and connotation than the hill of the pig, So place names and
they give an understanding of life, really, what has happened in the past as well, definitely. Yeah. So I know even from when we've looked at sort of land management and deer management and things in particular, again, the place names play such an important part of that, and it helps you then understand, that's how it would have happened in the past, and you can see the shifts in practice even with land management.
There's so much to learn in the drawing together of heritage and the now that I think is encapsulated in this project, because you're going back, the place names, you're going back to the geology, the seismic geology of it, so you could get really poetic with it, but there's a lot of language. Going back to your question, there's loads going on.
Also, what stood out for me was you saying, when you come to a place, you really have to take the time to get to know and understand before you know what it is that you bring additionally. How you can find your own place. And there's something about the work, Ginny, that I really liked, that I feel like there's almost nobody or I imagine that there's almost nobody who would listen to it who would understand every single layer of it. Even if it's down to the seismic, the shifts, or for me, the Gaelic, and I quite like that, because it's touching on the fact that you have to be humble, as you'd said earlier on, Lucy, you have to be humble in the fact that you don't know. So therefore you come with listening. And that's where you come with sharing. So it's like, you don't need to tell the whole story, I suppose is what I'm getting at. You just need to get people to be curious enough and to realise, to want to learn the story at a deeper level and know they can probably never know.
I think one of the nicest moments was, we went out on a walk, just for September, I think we all went out on a walk. And you started telling me about all the little landmarks that had a specific Gaelic name associated with it. I was like, that's beautiful. That's where we'll start. Tell you what, you do it all in Gaelic and then you translate it for me and I'll do the English translation. Fiona was like,
on the spot.
No.
You can't live translate.
It just doesn't work like that. Because you can't. A lot of the words aren't translatable. They're historic. They're people's names of from 300, 400, 500, 600 years ago. Completely, and that's the problem I think with how folk have tried to anglicise Gaelic in the past by translating it, and that's where it's become mistranslated or what's the word? Misinterpreted, or where you start to lose the nuances of the language or the culture. And
we've known each other for a wee while,
I
but
asked
we've never worked creatively together before. And your practice is, although we're both social in our practice, I'm a photographer and designer, you're more maker. I don't even know how you describe yourself. Don't even have that conversation, but more gallery. It was really interesting working within a potentially more gallery-based object type thing, and that itself was a learning curve, because that's not how I've worked in the past. But trying to figure out how we could have all of this social stuff and work it with the making, that was really interesting. I think it was really fun.
Yeah, I mean, it keeps going back to you keep using the word storytelling, and I think so much of the art that I really engage with is something that is good storytelling. But that in itself, and I like that, and I like that idea of this kind of work being a conversation. Because a good story is something that you can get engaged with and you can join in with, or you can completely turn on its head and retell in a different way or add to. And I think because this last year has been so difficult, we really had to rethink how can you hold a social practice when you can't actually be social. And I think I was lucky in that I had Fiona to work with, because this conversation just became a conversation in a different way. So it was a conversation that became a conversation that became a conversation that became a physical iteration of a conversation. Which was kind of nice.
In between.
Yeah,
the general way that we go.
But I think the physical aspect of the project has been pretty important, I think, too. I mean, so for me, I felt like it just fits beautifully because it's subtle, it's beautiful, it incorporates sort of the QR codes, so they're sort of modern and you can touch it. Whereas I don't think this community would appreciate something that they couldn't touch, or they didn't have, the ability to physically handle, or there's no point doing something that just is beautiful but meaningless. I think it just fits really well what people would want from it, expect. Yeah, I think so. And it's not out of place. They're not out of place at all.
Yeah. It's definitely it points to it being a public art project.
Yeah.
Because of the nature of the material. It's bronze.
And it's not, I guess a lot of the other things that we see, from a non-arts person, I think we see commemorative stuff and it looks lovely, but you don't really touch it, you don't really even maybe engage with it. It's just marks, And I think to have something you can touch, and I can imagine even we do outdoor sessions with children throughout all the holiday periods, and I can imagine that becoming part of some of our sessions, and then you get that opportunity to talk about, do you know about community ownership? So I think it opens it up a lot more to a much broader sort of spectrum of people.
Just to touch on that process there, and the process of you kind of just you kind of just translate. I wouldn't know that. I would go and go, oh, there must be what's the equivalency there to my language. Until I think you actually told me, and it was through this process. I have you on it. So. You're sharing learning. But there was a humility then immediately at that point, or whatever, where you were pointing at, and then you went, oh. And I think that's such a kind of good thing for an artist, because it's being responsible for that part as well. Because we're
terrified. The first email I sent to Richard Bracken was probably after our first working session, and I just sent him an email and I said, "Are you feeling the pressure?" And he said, "Yeah." Because it's huge.
Big responsibility.
It's a huge responsibility to do these stories justice.
Mm-hmm. Definitely,
I did feel a bit worried. Oh, I did. Well, I mean,
it's been a brilliant result.
Yeah, well, that's good.
And I think it's even lovelier that it's open-ended.
Yeah.
You've left space for growth. You've left space for, recycling. You've not even mentioned that just now, but there's the opportunity for, the form itself to change in the distant future. I hope not soon.
I'm going to drop a contract. I just thought about that yesterday. Did I tell you?
I think you mentioned it about the
Tell us.
I was just thinking about it. It's like what we'll need to do is we'll need to sit down. We'll need to work out how we keep or store these things, or when we take them out, and to who. And I thought, well, actually, it might be quite useful to sort of draw up a little contract between you and the object. Mm-hmm. Which would be quite nice. I think that would be quite nice.
You want us to adopt them?
Sort of. So maybe there's a contract between the viewer, the object, and the artist. And maybe if at some point the object starts to become invisible to you, then you have an obligation to cut it up and remelt it into something else. So that it's not. I mean, the worst thing I think you can do with an artwork is for it to become invisible.
Yeah.
You want it to keep going. So if it can't keep going, then let it become something else.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard this Caledonian Victory vessel. Please listen very carefully to the
Anyone who's ever visited this island will tell you there's a mysticism to Lewis, as if something is living beneath our feet, a voice that rumbles with the tide. Ginny's work here is less of an invitation, instead a discovery, a solid form that speaks through a formless world, a digital one, It's in this and the layers of voice from the island to its heritage, to the community and the outsider, that lies the question. The thrill of discovering which leads right to the heart.